In 1933, the Nazis under Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, and over the following years before the outbreak of World War II in 1939, a considerable number of leading people in the sciences and the humanities and the arts emigrated from Germany and came to the United States. And they had made a permanent impact on the culture and science of the United States. And what we're going to discuss today is how two of the most prominent emigres saw the United States when they first came here, because their movement from Europe to here was really quite remarkable. They were still very young. They were under 30, but they were already recognized as extremely promising physicists, and in fact they had already accomplished a great deal of permanent importance. They came from the cream of European physics to upstate New York, which I think it's fair to say was at that time not the center of the intellectual universe. And the discussion we're going to have is their reflections on how they saw things when they came here back then. The first person that we're going to talk to is Hans Bethe. Hans obtained his PhD in 1928 in Munich under Professor Arnold Sommerfeld, one of the great teachers of physicists in the history of physics, and he then worked with Enrico Fermi and had become a very prominent young man when he arrived at Cornell in 1935, having left Germany shortly after Hitler's rise to power. Victor Weisskopf came to Rochester, the University of Rochester, in 1937 from the Bohr Institute. He had obtained his doctorate in Göttingen, which was for a long time the most prominent center of both pure mathematics and theoretical physics, certainly in Germany and arguably in Europe and the world. Quantum mechanics was discovered basically at Göttingen. And after having obtained his PhD there, Professor Weisskopf, who I will call Vicky, was a postdoc, as we now call it, with not only Bohr, but with Wolfgang Pauli and Erwin Schrödinger. So these people arrived very young, very prominent already, considering their youth, in upstate New York, and in the 30s. And so I'll first turn to Hans, since he came here first, 2 years earlier, and ask, first of all, maybe you could tell us quickly how it is that you came to Cornell.
Well, when I was with Sommerfeld as a postdoc, he gave me some people to instruct, to guide. And among them was Lloyd Smith, a young theoretical physicist from the United States, already then at Cornell University. I gave him a subject to work on, and he did this and came out with an interesting paper which pleased him. And so when he came back to Cornell University and knew about the Nazi upheavals, he said, "Why don't we get Hans Bethe?"
I see. Now, I thought you had also told me that in some way Bragg, a very prominent, for the listeners, a very prominent British physicist who had already won a Nobel Prize at that time, or was about
yes.
to, was also somehow involved in your coming to Cornell. Is that correct?
Yes. When I left Germany in the fall of '33, I went to Manchester, where Sir Lawrence Bragg that's the younger of two Brags, was professor. And I stayed there for a year, but he had a job for me only for a year because one of the, so to speak, assistant professors was on leave. So it happened that Bragg came to Cornell for a short time in winter and found this quite a livable place, and wrote a letter on my behalf, which I don't think I've ever seen, which was favorable on the basis of my having been at Manchester and worked on some matters of interest to Bragg. Yes, Bragg had the Nobel Prize. He got it together with his father for the discovery of obtaining crystal structure from X-ray diffraction. Lauer was the first to find X-ray diffraction, but the two Braggs determined the crystal structure of rock salt, quite early, I guess, 1913 or so, and got the Nobel Prize together a few years later.
And Vicky, how did you happen to get to Rochester?
Well, it's a somewhat different story. I was, as you said, postdoc, or as they call it, assistant there, with Wolfgang Pauli until 36 for 3 years. And the contact could not be renewed because of the difficulties of foreigners having a job in Switzerland. And then I came to Niels Bohr. I was already before at Niels Bohr's Institute in the early 30s. And Niels Bohr at that time had a whole collection of German and Austrian scientists of Jewish descent who lost their job under Hitler. And really extremely famous people like James Franck or Otto Robert Frisch and so on. And so he asked me to come there and join this illustrious group. And of course it was clear to all of us that this was only not forever, that was only
a holding pattern.
Holding pattern, temporary position. And Bohr was absolutely excellent at that time, because not only he got money for us, actually I was paid by Carlsberg beer factory, which had a foundation for cultural purposes, and since then I only drink Carlsberg beer. But then Bohr went every year to England and America, as we called it, to sell his refugees. And he came, on one of the trips, he came to Rochester, New York, where a position was actually a rather low position in instructorship, was actually free, and he talked them into making an offer to me. So I got an offer at that time. Actually, at the same time, I got several offers to go to Soviet Russia, where they knew me from previous visits. And fortunately, that Rochester offer came, although it was much less prominent than the Russian offers. If I had gone to Russia, I don't know whether I would be alive here. And anyhow, it was clear to me that this is the opportunity I have to take immediately. And I accepted this offer and came then in the fall of 37 with my wife over to Rochester.
Now, could I ask, did you, of course, you've become close friends for a long time now,
Yeah.
for it's getting close to 60 years here. Were you, how well did you know each other before you came to the States?
Well, I would say reasonably well. We met, I was never for a long time at the same place as Hans, but we met at Copenhagen and at other conferences. And I remember, if I may, an anecdote. I was about to calculate the some important calculations of a new theory that Pauli and I have invented. And I knew that Hans did it for another theory, for the actual theory. And I went to him and said, could you tell me how to do this? So he gave me the details, because I'm not a very good calculator. And then I asked Hans, how long do you think does it take? And he said, it would take me 3 days, it will take you 3 weeks. And indeed it did. And in addition, I made a mistake. I published the wrong figure. So that was one of my encounters with Hans.
I think that was the main encounter.
Yes, so.
I was in Copenhagen for 1 month in 1934. And you were a fixed institution there already.
Yes.
So I liked to imbibe the atmosphere of Copenhagen, and you were part of the atmosphere.
Well, that's exaggerated, but it was certainly interesting.
So how did you find Cornell, for example, when you came here? What was your impression of not only the faculty, but the students and the intellectual atmosphere generally?
Well, I came here, and in the field that I was especially working on, nuclear physics, I found them very ignorant, but also terribly eager to learn. I had never found a group so eager to learn as I did here.
I see.
I had worked on the theory of atomic nuclei in Manchester before I came here. And so I knew a little bit of it. And I was very fortunate, because Cornell was very ambitious to do nuclear physics. They had got themselves Stanley Livingston, who had collaborated with Lawrence on making the first cyclotron. In fact, it was Livingston who built the first cyclotron. Lawrence had the idea. So Livingston was busy planning and building the cyclotron at Cornell, which was the second cyclotron in the world.
Oh, really?
It was extremely small, but it gave very good research. It gave very good papers on nuclear physics. He was an excellent experimenter and machine builder, one of the best. Later on he went to MIT but he didn't know any nuclear physics.
I see.
So he was terribly eager to learn, and so was Lloyd Smith, who had been my earlier friend, and so seemed to be everybody. It was just wonderful how everybody wanted to know nuclear physics. I was also called to other universities already in my first semester. I was asked to give a colloquium at Columbia and I believe at Rochester. There were close relations between Cornell and Rochester, and certainly at Purdue University. So everybody wanted to learn, and to everybody I told the same story over and over again. So I said to myself, well, that's rather strenuous. It would be easier to write it down. So that way I started to write 3 issues of the Reviews of Modern Physics, this essentially a textbook of nuclear physics at the time.
I should say that they were called the Bible at that time. Yeah.
For a long time afterwards.
For a long time afterwards.
When I became a graduate student at MIT of Vicky's, it was still possible to buy the Reviews of Modern Physics, and I have it still. In fact, I think I've had you autograph it. And I remember people still studied it. That was in 1952, so that was 16 years later.
It was then superseded by the book.
Yeah, but later, you know, the book, our book, Bethe and Weisskopf on nuclear physics, came out, 52.
Yeah, it came out just when I arrived at MIT.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So
now Bacher was here.
Well, our department chairman, Gibbs, was very ambitious. He wanted nuclear physics to be really important at Cornell. And so we thought there should be another experimental physicist. And we, in fact, Gibbs and I discussed together whom should we take. And we finally decided on Bob Bacher, who was at Columbia University and who came when asked half a year after me.
Or just half a year after you.
He afterwards became the first scientific commissioner of the Atomic Energy Commission. In between, he was the most important division leader at Los Alamos, namely the one in charge of developing the apparatus to develop the method of assembly of the nuclear weapon. And he became a very good friend of mine. So it was then three of us here.
And how was it at Rochester?
Yeah, let me perhaps, before I answer this, Bacher was co-author of one volume.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, it has a certain similarity. In '36, when I was waiting for a job at Bohr's Institute, I was actually up to then mainly interested in quantum electrodynamics and the theory of quantum theory of electricity and magnetism. And I thought it probably would be important to get a good job in America to become a nuclear physicist. So that was a great opportunity at Bohr's. Bohr himself was very interested. At the time he conceived the concept of the compound nucleus. And so I studied this very much and wrote a paper on nuclear temperature and things of this kind, and which I...
Did you write that before coming to Rochester?
Yes. I wrote this in Copenhagen.
Yes.
And sent it to the Physical Review. Actually, it was my first paper in the Physical Review because I thought it would help me to get a job in the United States. And it probably did. And so in some ways it was also nuclear physics. And at Rochester, they also built a cyclotron, of course somewhat later because I came 2 years later.
Somewhat later, but somewhat bigger.
Somewhat bigger, yeah. And Sidney Barnes was the Livingston at Rochester, who became a very close friend of us, both of my wife and I, and his wife. And they were just as eager to learn nuclear physics. They had not many, actually very few theorists there, and so I also had to give talks on nuclear physics. And I think that my paper probably played a role to when Bohr tried to sell me to Rochester.
But how did you find the sort of the intellectual atmosphere at Rochester?
Well, first, let me say, I found it wonderful. But let me say that it isn't hard to find something wonderful when you come from Nazi Germany. And But still, I mean, what probably both of us found so attractive here was just the close collaboration between the experimenters and the theorists. And I was never a very sort of mathematical theorist, and I always had great interest in experimental physics. And so my collaboration with Barnes was very useful, and there were a lot of other, Campbell, who died, another experimenter. It was wonderful, this kind of collaboration, as I could explain them and they could explain me the tricks. And then the cyclotron made a tremendous impression. But I would like to say more about at least my impression of coming to America. Not only that this is a country where Nazism is far away, but somehow one did not feel as a foreigner. One was so accepted right away. And I always like to tell my American friends that America is the only country where having an accent is an asset and not a drawback, as it is in England or in France or in the European countries. And one is considered to be interesting. And it was quite clear that we were at the center of the parties. We had to tell about Europe and about the great problems. And somehow it was delightful. The friendship of the people. In other words, we really enjoyed these first years very much because we didn't expect them.
So it was not as if you felt you had been cast adrift on a desert island.
No, on the contrary. No, we were cast adrift on a paradise is perhaps an exaggeration, but a pleasant. Of course, it must also be said, to be honest, that at least in my case, that it was a very lowly job, badly paid, instructorship. And I think with the kind of record I had in my previous papers, if I had been a native, I would have had a better job. But this wasn't so important. Of course, it was important in respect of relatives. For example, people asked us, "Will you get children?" And we said, first we have to get parents. Because my father was dead, yeah. But my mother and my sister, brother, they were still in Vienna, and we came just a year before Hitler took over Austria. So we had then a year later to find places and jobs. Actually, a very good friend of mine, George Winter and his wife, who came to Cornell, and Hans helped me to get him here. So it was a difficult time, but people had a very great understanding for it.
And how did you find Cornell generally?
Well, I would say just the same thing. I felt at home almost immediately. And just as Vicky said, the people here received me as if I was one of their own.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just before, I had a year and a half in England, which I enjoyed very much. They were very nice to me, but they always treated me as a foreigner. An agreeable foreigner, but still a foreigner. Whereas here, you were immediately one of the group. And I had never had that before, even in Germany.
Even in your native Germany.
Right.
Yeah, I see.
And so it was not only the faculty, but also the students, the graduate students, were just delightful. And I wasn't used before to be a comrade of the graduate students, yeah. But here
So even in a place like Munich, under Sommerfeld, it was still a very stratified...
It was still stratified.
Yeah.
I was a graduate student there too.
Yes.
And I looked with respect to the assistant professor who assisted. Sommerfeld.
respect and awe, sort of. We didn't want to bother them, you know, with
Yes.
questions and so on. Of course, it was different at different places, but
Right.
anyhow, it was no comparison to here. Of course, we were young. You see, we were not much older than the graduate students,
Right.
and so we were one family.
Yes, but some of the somewhat older faculty also were right
that's
in the same group. So this was just wonderful.
But I must tell one story, which you remember certainly. Rochester and Cornell had lots of good relations, not only because of our friendship, which grew very much. And very often I came to Rochester, to Cornell, to discuss physics with Hans. But it was already established. And every year, I think once a year, we had a picnic on Lake Canandaigua.
In Skaneateles.
In Skaneateles, right. And there, of course, baseball was played. What else? And then they always selected groups. You know, the group leader, the best one, selected people. And we were always the last ones.
Yes.
Indeed, it was always said that the Cornell group puts me in the Rochester group so that they can win easier, you know, and vice versa for Hans. And it was a fact. We did not contribute much to the play.
But this also illustrates how nice the life was.
That's right. That's right.
We were a very small department
Yes, that's the point.
at the time.
How many graduate students did you have?
I think we may
I mean, the
have,
department had.
the department may have had 30 or at the most
Oh, that
40.
many.
That's
That
already
many.
much more than we had.
Yeah.
15 in
Yes.
the department, and
Right.
I knew everybody and his girlfriend. You know,
Yes.
personally.
And we probably had about 12 or 15 faculty.
I see.
Please, I apologize to the feminists. There were women students, but very few, very few.
Yes.
There were some negative sides. The one from which I suffered most was that the rooms were overheated.
All right.
I think that has become better.
That has
But-
become better, yeah.
Also, I have become more used to it. And the other was faculty meetings. The first faculty meeting I attended was given almost entirely to the question whether there should be a vending machine in the basement of Rockefeller Hall. And there was endless debate about that. So there were some very small town attitudes as well.
There were no faculty meetings at the European universities. This is an institution that didn't exist.
In
Well,
Europe.
even at the highest, I mean,
No, well, there was a council, and there were,
Yes.
of course, there was the rector, which is the president, and but
Yes, there was a senate.
the senate. But the faculty in general had not much to say.
Yes, right.
You had to teach.
Then also I had the impression, just on the train from New York to Ithaca, that this was a very empty country.
Yeah.
There were fields, there were
forests.
forests, mainly forests.
Mainly forests.
And
That has unfortunately also changed.
yes,
Yes, they cut them down.
and so it was a very empty country, and I had the feeling that there was nothing really, no habitation between Ithaca and New York, which wasn't quite true.
Yes. Well,
But
go ahead.
These were some of the outward impressions, but generally, after one semester, it was perfectly clear to me that this is where I wanted to live, that this would be my home. This already was my home. I returned to Germany to visit my parents in the summer of 35, and I already felt that I no longer belonged there.
But it was also a terrible time.
Yes.
It was in the midst of the Nazi development. Yes.
But
That-
you mean even socially you didn't belong?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I am an Austrian and born in Vienna, and Vienna was not under the Nazis,
Yet.
although the political situation was pretty grim there too. So when I returned, it wasn't that bad, and I always had great attachment to the European culture, especially in Vienna. But then later, after 38, of course, it was just as terrible. And we were...
Did you ever go back before the war?
Yes, once, yes. And but
Before the Anschluss.
before the Anschluss, of course, yes.
Yes.
Because I loved the landscape. Somehow I was very
Attached.
bound to it. But then, of course, it was fantastic. But I must say one thing also impressed me. I should say that. At that time, when I was busy to get my parents, you know,
Yes.
and my sister and my friends and so, you had to write an affidavit that before they get a visa. I should say that we didn't need a visa because we were...
We didn't
if
need
you-
an affidavit. We had a visa.
A visa, yes, but no, I said it wrongly. We did not wait for the quota.
That's right.
We went here outside the quota because there is the rule: if you have a job as a teacher and a clergyman, you come in without the quota. We can get a visa
Right.
directly, and that was got a tremendous advantage when you
Tremendous
remember
advantage.
when you remember these terrible things that our friends had to suffer. To get in this country, they had to go first to South America or to Canada. And very bad. And what I found so
That
impressive...
wasn't as bad yet when I came here.
I see, yeah.
But when you came here...
It was very bad, yes.
and
Oh yes, well of course I'm also a refugee and I
Yeah,
remember.
you know
Yes,
that.
I mean in fact
Yeah.
in Vienna people had, everybody had in their passport a visa to Hong Kong.
Yes.
Yes.
No, to Shanghai,
Shanghai.
Shanghai, because Shanghai was a free city,
Yeah.
and if at the last moment you couldn't get any better place,
Yeah.
you went to Shanghai. And
Yes.
my father had, in fact, a rather remarkable case of somebody my father went through the University of Vienna with, who showed up in Montreal in the 50s, having, in the meantime, having moved from Vienna to Germany, where he, of course, got embroiled in the Nazi business, and then he couldn't go anywhere except to Shanghai. And then he finally established himself in Shanghai, and then, of course, the communists came in and destroyed everything, and he had to leave. So he came 30 years after my father and him had last seen each other. He had essentially been a refugee for 30 years.
Yeah, and that's not a special case.
No,
Many
it's not
cases,
unique.
Many cases like that. Now, what I found impressive was this: I could only give an affidavit for my mother because because of my low salary.
Yes.
And the wonderful thing was the collaboration of the Jewish organizations in Rochester. They were always ready to give affidavits. After only a few conversations to my sister, to my brother, and to George Winter, who was my closest friend.
You brought George in with an affidavit.
Yeah, with an affidavit from my Rochester family. And so I must say the help we got was really very impressive, I must say. It was a surprise because we did, in Europe there was this prejudice before Hitler that America, that's an uncivilized country, and it is true that many people thought that the population in America were criminals in Europe who fled to America.
Sent by their family to America.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Now, and of course, we learned otherwise. I must say, the Rochester days I really remember with great pleasure, because of not only were you part of the society there, but you were even more than part of the society. You were considered as most interesting and as most desirable to have in a party, and so that and we didn't expect that. And then came the war, where both you and I went to Los Alamos, and you returned to Cornell, but somehow my wife and I fell in love with the Boston, Cambridge area. We had many friends there, so I accepted an offer. Of course, after the war, it was incredibly easy for a physicist. If you compare this.
Well, MIT was a much more prestigious
true enough.
University.
Yeah, but not as beautiful as the Rochester campus.
Right.
Or this campus here at Cornell. And so we went to Boston. But still, I like Rochester very much.
Now, did you have, did your groups at Rochester and Syracuse have regular contacts in physics also, or did you?
Yes, not Syracuse. No, Cornell.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. I meant Rochester and Cornell.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
There were,
it wasn't only the joint
baseball.
picnic at Cornell.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Not only the baseball. No, it was also physics. And I often came here, as I said before, first of all to talk to Hans and also to colloquia, and we had actually common little conferences on certain subjects. And it was quite, there was a close connection. It's a wonderful drive.
Yes.
Speaking of conferences, I said before that I found people very ignorant here.
Yes.
But that wasn't true of America in general. There was an annual conference arranged, I think stimulated by George Gamow, the astrophysicist, and arranged by the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism of the Carnegie Institution.
In Washington.
In Washington. And they got together some 15, 20, 30 physicists, theoretical as well as experimental, mostly theoretical, however. And this was a very stimulating affair. Also, of course, the meetings of the American Physical Society were very stimulating those days. It wasn't just an enormous group of people.
Yes, they were in the hundreds, and now they're in the thousands.
That's right.
And that makes a big difference. And now there's a hotel, and at that time it was always at the university or in the Bureau of Standards.
In the Bureau of Standards, which had a wonderful garden in the height of spring blooming, rhododendron everywhere, and there was a lawn, and it was most pleasant.
Yeah.
And most of the discussions were on the lawn.
Yeah, and it was really, we learned a lot what goes on, and not in other fields and also in our fields.
Right.
It was great.
And these conferences at the Carnegie Institution were really great. That is, those brought together the theoretical physicists from all over the country, and we discussed really the depth of theoretical physics, the subjects that really interested us.
But I should add something. The department did not pay for us.
No.
Not at all. I mean, the idea
You had
that
to
you're
pay
paid
for the trip out
for
of
the
Europe.
trip or for the stay, hotel or so, no, not at all. I mean, we drove together. I mean, we had driving pools, and there we stayed with friends. I admit I stayed with Edward Teller.
So did I.
So did you, yeah. I should say it, by the way, I mean, that Edward Teller's house was a very important place to meet people. It was always an open heart, and Teller himself was, at that time, it was very interesting.
And Mrs. Teller.
Oh, Mitzi, yes, sure. No, these were wonderful times. But of course, we all knew or expected that the war will come and that America could not stay out. There was the big discussion between isolationists and we were, of course, being from Europe and having seen it, we were on the side of well, it wasn't called interventionist,
no.
but you could call it that way. And it happened then, of course, and that was a very difficult thing.
Now, this was, of course, you came during the Depression, and was there resentment by American scientists that you were taking positions that they would have gotten if you had not come? Did you encounter that?
Not so much, because we had positions that were recognized as being below our. That may not be in your case.
That wasn't true in my case.
No.
In fact, a prominent member of the faculty was very much against my appointment.
I see, because of that.
Because of that.
Because of that. Yeah. And when I came here in 1935, the department was full of postdoctoral people who had temporary positions as instructors at a very low salary, I guess something like $1,000 a year.
Yeah.
And were just waiting here in a holding position for a job.
Yeah.
Next year it was already cleared up there. I think all of them left in the fall of 1935.
But did they get jobs?
They got jobs.
Really?
I generally, when I came here, did not have the feeling that there was a depression.
Yes,
really?
we did
And
not.
as a matter of fact, of course, the depth of the depression was 1932 to 1934. It was over when I came.
Yeah, but then it came
didn't
down.
it come
Well,
back?
it
Come
was,
back in 1937.
it was rising.
It was rising, yeah.
But there was, I know, resentment against foreigners taking positions, and there were some Americans, good ones in fact, who could not find a job.
It's comparable today with the influx of Russian scientists.
Yes, that's why I partly was wondering.
But I would like to tell this, so to speak, publicly. What's the first name of Schiff? Who wrote the Leonard Schiff, yeah. Leonard Schiff was also considered, he was very, very young, for the position I got, simple instructorship.
He was a student of Oppenheimer.
He was a student of Oppenheimer. And now the department then decided, probably under the influence of Niels Bohr, to take me. And I found, fortunately, in the files of the Rochester department a letter that Schiff wrote to Rochester after he heard that I took the position he wanted. And he said, I am of course disappointed not to come to Rochester, but I am very glad that you choose a refugee from Europe, and especially that you chose Weisskopf, which would be very useful for American physics. That I find this touching.
Lovely.
It's lovely, yes.
Yes.
So the prejudice was not shared by everybody.
Oh, of course not.
Yes.
But I was just wondering whether you encountered,
Yes,
resentment.
Sure, to some extent.
I never
Personally
felt that, except for the somewhat muted hostility of the senior faculty member.
Of this one person?
Yes.
I see. How did you find the qualities and the preparation of students for research here as compared to Europe when you came?
Well, I think it was about the same.
Really?
And in particular, one thing was much better here than in either Munich or Manchester. There were regular courses in quantum mechanics before I came already.
Before you came?
Yeah.
There were not only that, in fact they were given by the senior theoretical physicist, but in addition to that, there were 4 special courses. And in my first semester I was asked to teach theory of the solid state on which I had worked.
Yes.
And there were several students taking it happily, interested, and prepared.
I see.
They knew enough quantum mechanics to take that course.
I would like to add to this that I would even go further. I would say that the American students were better educated, because in Europe you were much more specialized. And in the field that you have chosen, or that field that your professor has given to you, there you knew perhaps more than the corresponding American student. But on the other hand, in Europe, we didn't know much about other fields. We were too specialized. Whereas here, a graduate student took courses in solid state, quantum mechanics, and so he was in a way more a physicist, prepared to be a physicist.
So you mean in a place like Munich, or there were no lectures on quantum mechanics?
Not given by Sommerfeld.
I see.
Yeah.
I see.
The assistant professor, Bethe, gave such courses, and in my last years there, he gave them regularly. But there were no organized courses at all in Manchester.
Well, that was the British
The British system.
It was like in Oxford and Cambridge, that people did their own reading and just had...
The graduate students did their own reading. Undergraduates were given a 4-week course by Pius and myself on quantum mechanics. And you can imagine what you can do in 4 weeks, three lectures.
At that time, especially.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that didn't change very much.
No, it was in Göttingen also. In Göttingen, I had the luck that there was also an instructor or assistant professor whom we all know very well, Gerhard Herzberg, who gave a course on quantum mechanics and atomic spectra, which was an excellent course. Actually, he wrote a book that is still excellent.
I have used it.
Yeah, that's right. And so we had the luck. But of course, there was a much greater emphasis on reading, and that lectures were not considered necessary. Here, I think one overdoes in the other direction, that you have to have lectures on any subject, as if no books existed. So it has its disadvantages.
Yes, you read for a degree, and
at Oxford and Cambridge, of course.
And in all English universities.
At that time, at least.
And in Germany also, to a good extent.
But it isn't called that. In
No,
Germany,
I say it's called, you're right. It's called study.
You study.
Yeah.
In England, you read.
Yes.
That's correct. Now, on the whole, it was really something that is unforgettable. I must say, this is not directly at Rochester, but during the war, I mean, when the war started, and
you mean the war started for America or in Europe?
41.
In 41.
Yes. Even then, we did not participate much, although we should, in the nuclear question, because especially Hans, but me, I also was an experienced nuclear physicist. Then we came to Los Alamos. And there again, I was impressed by the sociology, but especially in my case, because here I come. I wasn't even citizen yet. And at that time, they were much more...
You were an enemy alien.
I was an enemy alien, but all it was necessary to have two people who guaranteed for me. In my case, it was Oppenheimer and Bacher. And then you had...
But that was special for Los Alamos.
That might have been special.
It was not true at Emeriti in the radiation lab.
Radiation, I see.
In the radiation lab, I could only come after I got my citizenship.
I see. Oh.
And then for a totally different subject, I had been cleared. And then the radiation lab said, well, now you are cleared. Now come here right away.
Yes. No, but what I wanted to say is, here as a foreigner, who is barely 5 years in the country, I was elected as mayor of Los Alamos, as a chairman of the town council. Now this was, for me, I mean, for a European, this is fantastic. You come 5 years in the country and you have the confidence of these people, which were mostly Americans, to be elected as a, well, I called it the mayor. That was a great thing for me.
So now you exchanged students, as I recall. Bob Marshak was your student and came to...
No, the other way around.
Ah.
Bob Marshak was my student.
And
he came as a postdoc.
And when he got his degree, he had to get a job, and that was difficult even in 1939.
Yeah.
And Rochester had an instructor's position open,
yes,
but only for 1 year, because it really belonged to Fred Seitz, who afterwards became president of the National Academy. Fred Seitz never came back to Rochester to claim that position. But Marshak went to Rochester strictly for 1 year. Then we would have to see again.
Yeah, but we could keep him.
He stayed there 30 years.
Yes, and became even head of department.
Right.
Yeah. Now, that was very nice to get Marshak from Hans. There may be others too, which I have forgotten, but they're not so prominent as Marshak. And we had a wonderful time. Maybe I should tell that story. Marshak, when he became professor, he invited me to come to New York to visit his father. And his father was one of these sweatshop tailors, who at home worked for very little money for some firm. And he had a long beard, so the real typical Jewish refugee, immigrant. And when I came in, he heard that his son has become professor. And he embraced me, and tears came down his eyes. And he said, all my sufferings were not in vain. My son is a professor. That impressed me.
So then, of course, after the war, things were totally different.
Yeah, totally different.
Totally, 100%. We could take any position we wanted.
No, but I mean also the atmosphere inside the institutions was quite different too, or not so different.
Not so different.
No, that I wouldn't say.
I think Cornell was not so different.
Except that, of course,
bigger, of course.
Bigger. The number of graduate students increased, to my mind, much too much, and I mean, we
not yet then. Those graduate students were so marvelous.
These are the GI.
Yes.
Oh, the ones right after the war.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
They were so marvelous and so terribly eager to learn, and they were generally so good. We never had as good a class before or after.
Because they were older.
They were
They were
older.
more mature.
They had many years when they
Yeah.
couldn't
Of course.
do physics, and now was the time.
Yeah. And all together, they were not in touch with any intellectual
Right.
activity.
Life during the
During the
military
war,
service,
yes,
of course, yes,
yes.
yes. Well, I think that's interesting. I've learned a lot of things. I had thought that you would have found an environment that was rather, when you first came, rather
Preaching
provincial.
to the savages.
Provincial.
So,
Yeah.
no, I mean, we made
And-
jokes of that kind, but it wasn't. Also culturally, I mean, outside physics.
Mhm.
In Rochester, there was a famous music school,
Yes, of
and
course.
I was very interested in music, and actually they put me on a committee there, and so one was in the middle. And then New York wasn't so far. At that time we traveled easier, I guess. There was, of course, no airplanes, or we couldn't afford the airplanes. There were airplanes. But to go to New York to see the museums and to the theater, it was an interesting life.
Well, thank you very, very much. It was a very interesting
Thank you.
conversation. Thank you.